Thank you for attending today's webinar, The 2024 Election, the Future of Democracy and LGBTQ Rights. Before we begin, the Williams Institute would like to acknowledge that UCLA is a land-grant institution located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. To start our discussion, we turn to our moderator for today, our Federal Policy Director, Elana Redfield. Elana?
Thank you, Kim. Welcome, everybody. I am so excited to be here with you all today with an incredible panel of leaders and experts to talk about where we are in this post-election world and how LGBTQ rights and our intersecting communities might be affected by the results of the election. I am going to introduce our panel and get right into it because we have a lot of great topics to discuss today. So first, we welcome Mauree Turner, they, them, who's the current representative for Oklahoma's 88th House District and a queer, non-binary Okie Muslim. Mauree was formerly the regional field director for Oklahoma's Campaign for Smart Justice, an ACLU initiative, and is the first Muslim elected in Oklahoma and the first non-binary person elected to a state-level position in U.S. history. Welcome. Also joining us today, Alissandra Rodriguez-Murray, from Hillsborough District 20, the New Hampshire House of Representatives. Representative Mauree is the current representative for New Hampshire District 20 and a queer, non-binary, first-generation Nicaraguan American. Alissandra is the founder and deputy director of the Reproductive Freedom Fund of New Hampshire, a mutual aid organization providing funding for abortion and gender-affirming healthcare to people in the Granite State. Andi Rich joins us today as well. Andi is a small business owner who ran an awesome campaign this year for Wisconsin State Senate District 12. And Andi advocates for rural communities, public schools, and clean drinking water. Welcome, Andi. We also have with us Cary Franklin, the McDonald Wright Chair of Law and Faculty Director for the Williams Institute, and for the UCLA Law Center for Reproductive Health Law and Policy, where she writes and teaches in the area of constitutional law, anti-discrimination law, and legal history. And joining us lastly is Andrew Flores, Professor Andrew Flores from American University, Professor of Government, and a visiting scholar with the Williams Institute. His research focuses on attitude formation, attitude change, and public policies affecting LGBTQ populations. I'll be your moderator today. My name is Elana Redfield. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Federal Policy Director at the Williams Institute. And by the way, for those who may not be familiar with the Williams Institute, I should mention that the Williams Institute is a leading research center on sexual orientation and gender identity law and public policy. And our mission is to ensure that facts and not stereotypes are informing the policies, laws, and judicial decisions that affect the lives of LGBTQI community members. Okay, so I'm going to open our discussion by giving each panelist a few minutes to talk about, generally speaking, their reaction to the election results, and maybe a few areas you think that LGBTQ community members, our families and allies should be paying attention to. And I'll start by turning to Representative Turner.
Thank you so much. Thank you for creating this space and having me here. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Mauree Turner. I am the I guess outgoing representative as of the 19th. I will be the former representative for Oklahoma's 88th House District. And my pronouns are they, them, theirs. So my initial reactions and to the election is realistically, I've been doing a lot of reflecting. I'm not surprised. Right. I think it's really important, but I also want to wrap that in the context of, so I was specific, like I was on a college campus in 2016 in that first election, college campus organizing. I remember the week leading up to the election, all of my mentors, my supervisors, everyone's just like, oh yeah, like that man will never get elected. Like, don't worry about it. You're going to be fine. Like all of these things. I'm also like the president of OSU's like NAACP chapter. And I'm like internally scared but like everybody around me, cause it's a PWI, predominantly white institution, is like, no, you don't have to worry about anything. And I'm like, okay, yeah, for sure. I remember having the watch party and we shut it off early and we were just like, I think everybody should go watch these results on their own. But I think like I was like ultimately what I'm saying is that I'm not surprised but I also know that it is important to have hope, right? To expect hope is the action of expecting a different outcome and working towards a different outcome. I'm not surprised, but I'm not disillusioned with the America that I have lived in my entire life, and rural Oklahoma at that. And so I think, you know, you can prepare as best as you can. Of course, heartbroken, and we all need time to rest and reflect and move through it, right, in the ways that work for us. But also thinking about like how there's a wealth of knowledge being shared about how folks figure out what's best for them in this time, right? Or how to go about like name and gender marker changes and figuring out like if you still have access to that and what it looks like to try to get married and all of these things, right? And so taking it in like that we are in a very real and sobering awakening, I think, for the first time for some folks. Some folks have been seeing it for a long time, and people come to the movement in this space at different times and always ready to plug in and do the work, but, you know, exhausted and heartbroken like everyone else too. So that's a little bit about me and how I feel about this election. Sorry.
Thank you so much. And I'll actually turn it to Andi now. I want to ask you, Rep. Turner mentioned rural people and how that affects them. And so I wonder if you want to speak a little bit to the impact of the election on rural people, but also anything you want to add about the election results.
Yeah, I actually was really surprised. I guess we had this false sense of security, and I'm not sure if it really came from the media, but when I was out door knocking, I was so well received. When and then the excitement over Kamala, really built. And so all these Democrats kind of came out of the woodwork to come together and show support in those last few days leading up to the election. And so I had this sense of it's going to be okay. People are going to do the right thing. All of these people that aren't paying attention are just not going to vote, right? Like it's going to be the people that care, that pay attention, that are coming out, that are speaking out, that are going to make this election. And I was so blindsided by this effect of the demonization. And looking back, hindsight being 2020, I should have seen it because I am rural. We are incredibly red. I wasn't expecting to win my race. I had a goal of 40%. And in my very, very red rural district, that would have been a huge win. That would have forced my opponent to, represent us, not just continue with Alex's agenda and, the extreme right agenda. And so when this came out and I lost and I only got 32% of the vote, which was pretty much status quo, which, in the 4 or 5 days afterwards, we found out was actually a win compared to what happened across the country. I was really thrown off guard. I did not see this coming. I didn't anticipate it. And I think hindsight being what it is, it's really this very effective campaign that they ran to completely demonize the Democratic Party, is my take on it. And so I think all encompassing, right? They focused on we're causing things to cost more and we're bad people. And I really was surprised by the election. I didn't see it coming at all.
Thank you so much. And I'll keep with the elected office perspective, and I'll turn to Representative Mauree from New Hampshire.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think I'm somewhere in the middle where, obviously I didn't want it to happen, but I did think a Trump win was very likely. I didn't think it would be like not as close as 2020. What I was more surprised by was like our in-state elections. We've had a Republican trifecta for the past 2 terms, and even they thought we were going to like reclaim at least one chamber, and instead we lost more ground in the House and Senate. And basically on the verge of a supermajority. The only chamber where they don't have a supermajority is the House, and we're still at it's a 400 state reps in New Hampshire, which is a lot, and Democrats are down by about 20 right now. What I was also surprised about, frankly, was me winning my race. I've been very much in the public eye in terms of issues like immigration and LGBTQ rights because of my identities and the roles I've taken in advocating for those issues in the state house, and have faced a lot of targeted harassment over the past 2 years because of my identities. So I was really surprised to have a red wave in not only the state but my district and still end up with the most votes, and trying to like figure out what that means in terms of like how the state and my constituents view me, and like how I can work with you know, the current makeup of the House. But yeah, I have a lot of concerns in particular with LGBTQ rights over the next 2 years, obviously nationally, but in New Hampshire, very much so. We have always been like a fairly LGBTQ friendly state, and the past 2 years was a huge departure from that. Last year, we passed a sports ban for trans kids in school. We passed a objectionable materials ban, which allows for any materials that are considered objectionable by parents to be like they require a 2-week notice and allow for kids to be pulled out of classes, and that was directed at LGBTQ literature in the schools. We passed a bill banning certain gender affirming surgeries for minors, and then we had also passed a bill to roll back trans discrimination law that we had passed back in 2018, which was vetoed by our governor. And now he was a Republican, but he was very much a moderate, and now he is not the one that's in power, and they have a supermajority. And I'm very concerned about that coming back, which is going to lead to like a bathroom ban and that sort of thing. And really trying to balance like being very real with people in the community about what's going to happen over the next 2 years in New Hampshire and the 4 years nationally, but also not try to cause so much alarm and panic. It's, hard to kind of balance those two things, but there's a lot we need to prepare for. Like Mauree was mentioning with like changing names and all, I have so many friends like personally that we're either going through like IVF treatments or like, marriage thing or like whatever, and we're all rushing to like change our passports and all this. I have a friend who literally just changed her birth certificate, was born in Florida last year. So we're all like, very focused on that kind of logistical thing. And as someone who also works at an abortion fund and helps with gender affirming care, it's like I'm dealing with it on both ends of like both the practical like logistic support of our community and also like the advocacy in the policy realm. So yeah, it's a lot.
Thank you so much. I'll turn now to Andrew Flores. We'll start hearing from the Williams Institute / academic, also researcher side.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I will slightly shift the tone just because, data and kind of what I took away from the election and the implications from the LGBTQ community, at least kind of things that stood out to me. So at least this election sort of sown kind of like a largely uniform shift in favor of Donald Trump and the Republican Party, right? And there's a growing consensus among political scientists that when it's such common broad pushes, that it likely means that there are pretty general explanations for such, and that's likely related to inflation and the economy. And that may help to explain some, but I don't think all of the outcome. I think there's a lot of other things that are going on underlying that too, and I have comments about that later. However, there was one group of voters that really bucked that trend, and that was LGBTQ voters. The exit polls from this year kind of indicated that LGBTQ voters supported Harris over and above their support for Biden or previous presidential candidates. So this year it was 86%. 86% supported Harris. That's huge. In comparison, in 2020, it was 64% for Biden among LGBTQ voters. And so that's in and of itself is kind of meaningful in terms of how LGBTQ voters are seeing our current political landscape and how that current political landscape might affect them. And then more importantly also is that LGBTQ voters kind of comprise about 8% of the electorate. That's higher than previous elections. And it's possibly because it was a lower turnout election in general. And so they actually comprised a larger share. And this is consistent with my prior work. My prior work has always kind of shown that LGBTQ people are kind of reliably turning out and engaged in politics. And so there's kind of this, so it still kind of shows that, you know, LGBTQ voters are reliably turning out and maybe even more strongly voting in favor of the Democratic Party. And it's important to kind of think about, like, if you think about silver linings or kind of implications of this for the future, I think it's important to know that, like, the voting power of LGBTQ people is likely to grow over time. If data that I've seen in other places, like about 1 in 5 younger generation people are identifying as LGBTQ. So now is the time to remember that there is power and that the future political influence of LGBTQ people will probably be even more strong as time goes forward. So I think that's an important thing to remember. It's like this is a slight inflection point, but it's not necessarily one that is kind of predictive of kind of the subsequent elections that we might see before us. And then my last comment on this regard is kind of just that there's been some chatter in media about kind of, is this election kind of a mandate for the Republican Party? And like this notion of the red wave. And I think that there's kind of more data to suggest that this is a closer election than, especially at the presidential level, than what would necessarily be thought of as a mandate, right? In terms of Donald Trump winning the popular vote, he's going to be winning it by less than 51%. I think Cook Political Report just said that it's going to be 50.8, if not less than that. So it's important to keep in mind that this was an extremely close race, and that most of our, you know, projections about what might happen in terms of the election was almost like a coin toss. It was 50-50. And so, you know, so it's very much not a mandate, and it's very much evidence of just kind of the divisions that kind of the constant kind of discourses and divisions that American people have. And I think it's going to be a bigger question in the long run about kind of why weren't people turning out to vote, say, for Harris and as they turned out for Biden, because it was a record election in 2020 in terms of turnout. And so that will be kind of the lingering things in terms of like the postmortems of the election and the election campaign. Yeah, and I'll leave it there for now. I have many other thoughts.
Thank you. And I look forward to getting back to those, but I really do appreciate that perspective on some of the nuances of what happened. I'll now, to close out our question, I'll turn to Professor Cary Franklin.
Yeah, thanks. I was going to say much of what Andrew said, perhaps predictably, given our similar situations in the world. But I guess my response was on social media. My social media the day after the election, 2 days after the election, was full of commentary of this is who we are. The Madison Square Garden rally is who we are. Get used to it. This is the America we live in. And I think there's something weirdly seductive about that vision when you're in pain and when you look at what happened and when you had some hope that Americans would see that rally and everything that it stood for and not embrace it. And then the side that performed that rally and all the rest of it won. But I guess I would just echo Andrew in saying this is going to end up being a very close race. Obama won by 4 percentage points in 2012. Biden won by 4 percentage points in 2020. So you really can't turn around and say this narrow victory actually represents who we are without explaining 2020, why maybe that doesn't represent who we are. In other words, this doesn't have a better claim of who we are. And ultimately, these are narratives that social movements tell about who we are. So one thing that has helped me get out of bed in the morning is to feel the importance of not letting that Trumpian narrative prevail, right? The Trump narrative is this is who we are. This hatred, this divisiveness, this cruelty, that's America. And I think that is not what this election shows. And I think it would behoove us not to buy into that narrative and to tell a different narrative, a more complicated narrative, but a narrative with some hope in it about what this country is. Let me undercut that slightly by just answering the what to watch for question. Two things I think are important. One thing that really came to the fore in this campaign is anyone who was saying this attack on transgender people is really just about youth and about protecting young growing bodies and about school, that is not true. We have seen the creep toward all transgender people, toward suppression of transgender adults in a million different ways. I would watch for that. And I would also say all of these issues are interrelated. So when the immigration crackdowns happen, when there are deportations, housing, healthcare, all of these issues affect the LGBT community and will be specifically targeted and felt most deeply by the most vulnerable among us. Those are transgender and LGBT issues more broadly as well. Please watch out for that. Those are our issues too.
Thank you so much. And I actually want to pick up on this question around some of the themes that you and Andrew just discussed. So Andrew, I'll turn to you with a question. A lot of discussion has been that a motivating factor here is the economy or inflation in particular. And it leaves me with this very cynical question, like, oh, so does it mean like the price of a sandwich is more important to voters than like the rights and dignity of immigrants or LGBTQ people? But I do think that's cynical. So I'd love if you could speak a little bit to what do we know from the polls? What do we know from what happened? And looking kind of at that lens around what is driving voters here.
Yeah, great question. And I think it's important to note that by all means, the economy could have probably been actually quite worse off without the leadership of the Biden administration and his coordination with trying to stall the inflation that we experienced. Like especially if you look at like other countries that have faced, similar inflation trends, like the way that they handled and managed that situation, you see their inflation experiences have been far worse. And so it's very much important to kind of think about like, yeah, the economy kind of played a factor here in terms of what people's lived experiences were, but they don't necessarily get to see kind of what that life would have looked like if there would have been a different party in power, or a different person in power, or different decisions that had been made. But with that said, inflation is something that people themselves can see and experience, right? And so that means that it can influence them in a way that is very different than thinking about other people or other groups. I often kind of think about the traditional American voter as someone who is constantly busy with their day-to-day lives, and they don't have the privilege that I do to think about politics like 24/7, right? That's my job. And so it's kind of like, in politics and groups and inclusion. So I have to kind of appreciate kind of the realities that people have to go through in their day-to-day experiences. And so that can in part explain that general shift toward the Republican Party. And so I think this vote seems to be less about Donald Trump, sadly, or to some degree in terms of his rhetoric, an overlooking of those elements for some people. And then kind of this general kind of rejection of the Democratic leadership, despite kind of like what those steps were taken in terms of trying to handle inflation. And I totally understand that this creates discomfort, because that means that people are willing to overlook the ramifications that this incoming administration can have on LGBTQ and other marginalized groups. Why might this be in terms of why were people able to overlook, say, these concerns? One is I think that first, of course, some people want to advance, say, an anti-LGBTQ agenda, but that is definitely a minority of the general public, right? And then second, some people kind of convince themselves that the Trump administration won't be able to do what it says it can do. Voters themselves can be short-sighted, and so they can say punish the party in power for their current economic situations, and that might also mean that as the economy that Trump inherits seems to be improving, it might actually be that they credit Trump with that than the Biden administration for that. And so that's so it's just a challenge in terms of trying to communicate, say, what's going on in policy and the economy and how people kind of see the immediate experience versus kind of the trajectory of that. But I will say though that this idea that people don't think that Trump can like make good on certain promises, or that's kind of disbelief that people have, there's already been some data points that already show that people who voted for Trump are already feeling some remorse, particularly around his current slate of nominations for leadership. And so there's already some people kind of feeling like maybe they should have made a different decision at the polling booth. And I think I have a couple more points here. And of course, I would be happy to invite everyone's perspective here. But I want to add a couple more points about the 2024 election and public opinion. One is that there was a sharp educational divide among voters. The college educated broke for Harris, while the non-college educated broke for Trump in quite stark ways. And this also coincided with voters no longer seeing the Democratic Party as the party of the working class. And those two things might be quite related to one another in terms of education and one's class perspective. And then many of you might have saw Representative Alissandra Ocasio-Cortez asking her own constituents who kind of voted for her and for Trump, kind of what motivated them to do so. And it kind of was that they were both kind of viewed as outsiders and kind of anti-establishment and kind of more authentic as candidates. And so there's kind of this idea that there was a sense for a time for change. And that time for change could be both seen as those that aren't necessarily like the traditional Democrat, and then also the traditional Republican. And so people might be overlooking, say, what they think of as traditional politicians to some degree. But I also just want to reinforce that this was not an overwhelming defeat, even though with a unified government that will carry with it a lot of consequences at the federal level. And that, again, I still think that this is more a story about voter turnout. And that why some people stayed at home. There are many possible explanations for that. I do want to note that a recent Washington Post article kind of highlighted that one of Elon Musk's PACs actually spent a lot of money to micro-target voters to kind of remind them or tell them things about what they didn't like about Harris, even if Harris didn't campaign on those issues. And this is a classic strategy of putting people up what they call a cross pressures. Basically, you might like everything about a candidate, but this is the one thing that you might not like. And the consequences of cross pressures might be that you just get people demotivated to turn out to vote. So I don't want to say that's 100% of the story in terms of the turnout, but I do want to say that there was a concerted effort to kind of reach out to specific segments of different communities, specifically in swing states, in order to kind of reinforce these things that kind of like talking to predominantly Muslim communities about, the democratic support for Israel, right? And kind of conversely doing things in other communities as well. So there's a lot to go on in terms of kind of all of those things. And then the last point I have on this is, which I know that you will bring up a little bit later, Elana, as well, but I do want to say that, marriage equality and abortion were supported by a lot of voters, right? In this last election when it was on the ballot, meaning that there were voters who voted for abortion protections and for marriage equality who likely also voted for Trump. So it sort of makes it obvious that for many voters, they were able to compartmentalize their positions on these important social issues from what they chose to vote for their president, right? And so I think it's really important to kind of think that that separation is actually quite important and kind of an important inflection point in this election.
Thank you so much. And I want to give anyone who wants to a very, very brief chance to respond if you have thoughts you want to share in response to Andrew's comments. Hearing none, I'll turn to the next question. We can always come back to it. There's a lot there of really, really valuable insight. I'm going to ask a question for Rep. Turner and Rep. Mauree about your experiences. So just thinking about on the federal level, we have progressive leaders who were reelected and we'll continue to represent progressive values in Congress while we have also this sort of expected trifecta of power for the or more conservative elected officials. And you have both operated in states that have legislatures that tend towards I want to describe them as hostile, but certainly have not necessarily enacted affirming legislation as you described, or have not been seen as particularly LGBTQ affirming. I know in Oklahoma and New Hampshire both had just an overwhelming amount of legislation in the last 2 years targeting LGBTQ communities and other constituencies. So do you want to share, I'll start with Rep. Mauree, do you want to share some insights about working in that kind of environment? Like, do you have suggestions or tips or just experiences that you'd want to share for our viewers?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the kind of treatment I received both from my colleagues and members of the public very much colors my experience of the past 2 years. I would describe the New Hampshire State House as fairly hostile. Like, I have many colleagues that respect me and many that very much do not. And especially when we were discussing LGBTQ related bills on the floor, there were like a lot of harmful things that were said that, not only affected me, but also like people that were in the gallery, like all these LGBTQ advocates. A lot of young organizers were very involved this time around that received they had really negative experiences in their advocacy work this time around, even in like one-on-one meetings with senators, literal minors being asked like what surgeries they had received in order to like defend their, right to play on a sports team or whatever. And I, received everything from like, the regular like Twitter harassment to like an actual white supremacist group that was like spreading pamphlets across the state with my name and information on them and a bunch of slurs. And it was obviously something that impacted my decision to run again or not. And I'm a stubborn person, and ultimately I didn't want to give them what they wanted, which was to make me leave the legislature. But I'm pretty involved in recruitment efforts here as well. And when I was doing recruitment, I was very real with people that I was talking about running with, about how it can feel to be a marginalized person in the legislature, and also that it doesn't happen to everyone. We had last session, we had 4 trans reps, and I was the only one that got the extent of the harassment that I received, but I was also the most outspoken and visible person. So I had one trans friend run this year for the first time, and really talked through with her what could happen and how is she going to like prepare herself for facing those kinds of scenarios. I've been very intentional over the past few months before session fully starts again in January of like building myself a self-care plan and like community care plan and working with grassroots organizations to do so, because honestly, there's so much, like, we all know like tokenization happens in a lot of these spaces. Like, Democrats have done a lot to like intentionally try and get LGBTQ folks, immigrants, whoever, to run for office, but then there's not institutional support in place to protect us from the kind of harassment we receive, or like support us through the kind of harassment we receive. And I've been trying to work with grassroots organizations to put those systems in place so that way, as especially more young people run in the future, there's some kind of support system in place for them, because I think that's what causes, a significant amount of burnout, and then like not returning to the legislature is like you get more hate than you maybe anticipated, and then the people who asked you to run aren't there to like support you when you go through that. Very much a like, realization, like the community, like we're the ones that are here for each other, and we need to like actually practice that as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Representative Turner?
I don't really know how to follow that one up. I mean, like literally everything that Rep. Mauree said. Like I think for me, coming into the Oklahoma legislature, I guess a couple of things, right? Like coming into the Oklahoma legislature, I knew that I would be the first Muslim that was elected in Oklahoma, like to a state to the state legislature. I did not know about being the first, and then like specifically want to name it first like out non-binary person, because like James, I think that also serves with Rep. Mauree, also non-binary, was elected before but I think there people talk about being the first out openly out person. So I guess like that's a thing, but also just like to remember that there are always people that are going to come before you, right? Like if you're the first, there's probably at least 100 people that tried before you. And so want to name, like, very thankful for everybody who came before me to be able to make a trans Muslim kid from rural Oklahoma, like in the state legislature, like put that person in the state legislature to make that possible. Like forever indebted for that. But that's exactly it, right? Is it like visibility without active like protection, right, is a target, right? And I think, and like for me specifically here in Oklahoma, how it felt in that first election was, well, actually, I guess like maybe how it felt in the second election was that like I just kind of felt like a shiny toy that folks were like, oh yeah, like this is really cool. Look at this thing that we did, right? But like when we sit in those rooms and we have those conversations about policy, right? Like that is Joshua Cary. That's who I was talking about. So sorry about that. Uh but like to be able to sit in those rooms and like have those conversations, like understanding that I knew that I have always grown up in Oklahoma, right? I knew the battle that I was going to be having with Republicans. I think realizing the amount of organizing that I was going to have to do in like with Democrats in the legislature around the same things that we were openly talking, like pushing back, fighting against Republicans for, we are having those same conversations with Democrats. And I think like the big lift there was I think was something that I didn't expect, right? Like I'm very type A. I try to cross all my T's, dot all my I's. Before I ran for office, I sat down with as many Democrats, like sitting Democrats in the Oklahoma legislature as I could. After I got elected, I sat down with as many like Republicans would talk to me. And because I care about my family and I care about myself, and I didn't want to put myself like in too toxic of a situation. And that was at a time where I didn't think that we would end up in a place like this. But I also want to name, right, that like there are so many things. Like I've also, like, for those of you, some of you know, some of you don't, right? Like that I ran to the left of a Democrat. Like I unseated a Democratic incumbent in Oklahoma, which some people frown upon. But I have been Black, queer, trans, Muslim in Oklahoma my entire life. And not most, all of my representation has been allies who at some point in time have said, and we know what's best for you. Please quit asking at this moment in time. And the people of House District 88 ran a campaign that said, like, we don't have to just have allies, like we can be our own representation. And that's powerful. Like sometimes I'm still in this point where I kind of disassociate. I'm like, we did that. And I'm like, oh, that's me too. Right. Like, but like, that's the thing, right? Is that like folks want not just like moonlit progressive politics, right? Like folks want community organizers, community activists. Folks want people who have had to live on the other side of the policies that they are introducing. People have had to think about like, do I have enough in my SNAP benefits this month, right? Like, oh my goodness, right? With budgeting, I actually can't afford to go to the hospital for this thing, right? And be able to pay bus fare to get to and from work, right? Like all of these things. And I think like there were a lot of hurdles for me that I didn't expect, specifically like with the Democratic Party. I will also say that I made the choice to not run for office again. So I won't be going back to the legislature in that way in 2025. Spent my years at the Oklahoma legislature before I was an elected official, and I will spend probably more decades after leaving office. But I think I also had a lot of health complications that arose that I also didn't anticipate, right? But because now I get to work a job where I have health insurance and get to take care of myself and get to go to the doctor, found out a lot of things. And so that was a thing too, right? So I had to think about whether or not I could do the type of internal organizing, right? And also take care of my health in a way that allows me to take care of my 5-year-old for as many years, hopefully decades, right, that I have left with him. And so want to focus on that right now. Also, I feel like I just keep saying also, I think ultimately what I'm saying is that like when it comes to engaging in politics, right? I hope that stepping away in this way, like, didn't discourage people from showing up in politics, but encourage folks to say, like, we deserve so much more, right? Like, we deserve so much more from elected officials who say that they care about us, but will ideally put our identities in a box or amend those parts of us away if it means getting a very shitty piece of policy passed right now versus a good piece of policy in the future, right? That keeps our communities intact. Folks want folks who have shared lived experience and not just sat in a classroom and said like, oh, and I learned about what you needed. I didn't, and I wasn't in community with you, right? And I ultimate being able to serve the people of House District 88, like that's the honor of a lifetime. It's been my hardest job and my favorite job thus far. I am a workaholic, so it really helped feed that, for better or for worse. And I still have eight more years I could possibly serve in the Oklahoma legislature. But I also think that in order for me to keep going, I have to take a step back right now. But it means that we still get an opportunity to have really intentional conversations with Democrats about what folks need right here and right now. Oklahoma, the first like outwardly non-binary person and the first Muslim happened right here in 2020, right? And that makes me so excited for the future that we have, right? For everything that we get to engage in together, right? Landmark legislation that has retroactivity for decriminalizing living with HIV and AIDS. That happened right here in Oklahoma, right? Like, and we have, so like, that was a little bit of like what it looked like inside, but the external piece too, right, is that when it comes to funding and folks like reaching into states to be able to help and think about that, like Oklahoma is often in this place where it's like, oh, it's too far south for us to be able to get engaged, right? Or it's too Midwest or Plains or what have you. And so we have always had to, which I think a lot of folks are talking about now, like we have always had to be here for us, right? Like we have our backs, right? We save us. And so the hope is that also with this election is that folks are looking at rural places that have progressive groups, communities, right, that are still fighting, right, whether it's queer communities, right, whether it is sex workers, right, like whether like what have you, like there are folks who are living in these areas who are doing this work. And so like the hope is that we are looking to them to see like, how are you surviving in this deeply red place? Because like that is where America is now. And how do we expand what you have done here to be able to catch the nation, right? And so I'm scared shitless like everybody else, but also ready to do the work. Very sorry for if you watch this back on recording and you didn't like that. So I guess like that's like my elongated tangent. But it brought a lot of chaos that I didn't expect and a lot of growth that I am so thankful for to be able to figure out how we do this work even better moving forward.
I mean, I know I am incredibly grateful for the work that you've done. And I know a lot of people in our chat are also sharing that. And everyone, I encourage you to continue to share that love in the chat.
Yes. Oh, sorry. I just want to add this too. Like, I want to let you all know that like the legislation for HIV and AIDS decriminalization, like that came from constituents in Oklahoma. I didn't just come to the legislature and I'm like, here are all these things that I think. Like a constituent brought that to me, right? And then I was able to reach out with the Williams Institute and they are continuously doing research here in Oklahoma so that we can continue to work on that without being in the legislature, with being in the legislature, and also what do we do outside of the legislature? Because that's the thing too, right? Is that like I would be a fool to tell you that everything we need to do has to be focused on the ballot box. It's also the community initiatives that we are getting like engaged with. I'm so thankful for the work that Rep. Mauree does, like beyond the legislation, right? Like that everybody here does beyond the legislation, because like it's not just about the policies and the paperwork, it's also about the community pods that we are creating. It's about the community organizing that we are engaged in too, because like the policy is not the only thing that saves us, we save us. So that thank you everybody, Williams Institute, like for the work that you do and the work that you allow us to be able to continue to do in a place like Oklahoma.
Oh, thank you. I'm gonna so I want to note in the chat we have a lot of questions, and a lot of them have to do with some really strategic discussions. And I encourage you to reach out to us directly for some of that. And also I know some of our panelists have been trying to respond in the Q&A, but obviously we can't cover all that in our 1 hour today. So I'll try to bring in some of it, but also I hope we continue the conversation, and do email us with specific questions around some of the challenges that you're facing, and how the policy landscape or research might be related. I want to turn quickly to Andi, and continuing on the state question, just really quickly, do you have thoughts on, sort of the state as a forum generally, especially now that the federal policy environment might be a little bit more challenging for LGBTQ rights? And thinking about, the fact that there have been victories at the state level, even in conservative states like Missouri and Montana that passed, abortion initiatives. So we've also seen Nevada, which is the only state besides New York, which just adopted an ERA, which protects LGBT people under its actual constitution. Nevada passed abortion protections, but also went for Trump. So states are an interesting context, right? An interesting environment. We've heard a little bit from our panelists already about that. So I don't know, Andi, I wanted to bring you in on this issue and what you think about states as a forum.
That's a really broad question that's very complicated, right? Like not just the states that you mentioned, but also interesting to note that Missouri overturned their abortion ban and also went for Trump. Wisconsin, I think a lot of it was due to the redistricting that we had, where we undid a lot of our gerrymandered maps. We actually undid a supermajority and also went for Trump. So I think that right now is incredibly important for us to focus on what we can do at the smaller levels to bring that up to the higher levels in the future, because that's really the difference that we can make today, right? And so just keep putting pressure. And I think really my big takeaway from this election and all of these conflicting statements that we're hearing from people, right, is don't get so discouraged. Like I know immediately what everybody wanted to say was, well, hate won. But I don't think that's so much the case as people really paying attention. We're not, okay, let me rephrase. Not enough people are paying attention, but the people that are doing their last minute research are focused on themselves and their pocketbooks, right? So I really believe that a lot of these terrible outcomes were more pushed by people believing this narrative that's being pushed about Republicans being more beneficial for their economic status and for their pocketbooks. And we all know that that's not true, but also Rachel Bykover gives a very convincing argument that 2% of people know as much as we do, right? Like if you look around on this call at the 400 and however many people are in here, we're the 2%, right? We're not the majority. So our neighbors that are making these decisions, that we look at them and go, what are you doing? They're not making it for the reasons that we made our decisions for. They're making it for completely different reasons. And so by focusing on these state level issues that we already know we have the support for is incredibly important. Unfortunately, in Wisconsin, we undid binding referendums when we got our incredibly gerrymandered maps because we no longer wanted people to have the power. So stay focused on your local issues and your local races and what you can do locally, because it really is going to be the difference maker for protecting your neighbors and protecting yourselves and protecting the people that we really truly care about. It's really not hatred that drove this election. It's mis and disinformation.
Thank you so much. And that's a topic that we care a lot about at Williams. We really focus on putting out the best, highest quality information. So we're going to take one more question for Cary, and in response to some of the things we've seen in the chat. So I think we have to name the Project 2025 in the room. And I'm wondering, Professor Franklin, if you could talk a little bit about Project 2025, which is a plan developed by a conservative think tank to help guide the Trump administration, and what we're seeing, what we might expect to see, and what we might see the president be able to achieve versus also potentially not able to achieve in the next administration.
Sure. I wish Andi had gone last, because I found that to be rousing, and what I'm going to say is rousing in a different way. And I'll try to turn it around at the end. But the truth is, Project 2025 and the Trump campaign promised a lot, promised a rain of bad things for the LGBT community. And I will just talk about some of them. Here's what I guess I will say at the opening. I think it's an open question how many of these things President Trump will actually pursue. And it is not clear that he will be able to accomplish this or even wants to be able to accomplish all of this. But I think some of the things he really did stress are and could achieve would be removing all protections for sexual orientation and gender identity from federal laws. One of the promises of 2025 is strip the word sexual orientation, gender identity, diversity, equity, inclusion, gender equality, gender equity, gender sensitive, abortion, reproductive rights, all of that from the federal code, protect all of the protections across the board, get rid of them. Not only strip anti-discrimination and other protections, but also use federal law as a weapon. So one thing Project 2025 talks about is Title IX. Not only remove the protections that the Biden administration has interpreted that law to provide, but also use it as a weapon, using Title IX as a lever to say, if you're a school and you allow people to use the bathrooms they want to use, if you allow them to use their correct pronouns, if you have libraries stocked with books that provide information about the world we live in, with respect to LGBTQ people, we will withhold funding from you. That is a real sword hanging over schools now. If you look at Trump's platform, not just 2025, but Trump's own platform, he lists as a top 20 priority for his administration, quote, keeping men out of women's sports. He's listing that as one of his very top priorities. You could see him using Title IX to do that. You could also see passage of a new law trying to do that. Let me shift to healthcare. Again, interpretations of the ACA to not protect transgender people in particular, LGBTQ people more broadly, banning the use of federal funds in Medicaid or Medicare to provide gender-affirming care or to protect transgender people's health. I think we will see some real attacks on healthcare and the use of federal funding. There's threats to deprive hospitals, government-funded hospitals that provide gender-affirming care of any funds, thereby making it impossible for them to provide that kind of care. There is a move to ban transgender people from the military and also reject applicants who are HIV positive. This one, I think, stands a strong chance of happening if Pete Hegseth, who has now been nominated for Secretary of Defense, actually is confirmed. This is the Fox News Weekend Post. He wrote a book called The War on Warriors, which I read for you all yesterday. You're welcome. He attacks transgender people throughout that book and says the American military's main problem these days is that transgender people and other other emasculating forces have ruined our troops. And he really wants to expunge LGBT people from the military. He calls for a frontal assault on transgender people and more progressives in the military. There's talk of a federal parental bill of rights of the sort that have passed in some states that would require schools to notify parents if students want to change their pronouns. Trump vowed to stop providing gender-affirming care in federal prisons and to enforce Republicans' restrictive definitions of gender in prisons and detention centers. Relevant to Williams, there's been Project 2025 agenda items that the CDC should stop collecting information on gender identity. Information we know is so powerful and the start of a lot of helpful things that have happened over the last couple decades. NIH should start funding studies into detransitioning and the negative effects of cross-sex interventions. And then I guess finally I'll mention the Project 2025 doesn't specifically attack same-sex marriage. Well, it says we endorse a biblically based social science reinforced definition of marriage and family. It talks a lot about how mothers and fathers are different and need to be supported in their traditional roles. My sense is they're waiting to see how far they can get and how far it goes, and that looms behind the more immediate efforts. Final thing I'll say is, as I began, I don't know how possible it will be to do all of this. Here's a silver lining or a ray of hope. I think this administration is going to be spectacularly incompetent. If you look at the people that have been nominated for leadership positions, this is not a crack team of legislators and knowledgeable folks. No, I'm not resting on that. I do think we're going to see some of what I just articulated, but I do think they are going to be hampered by their narcissism, incompetent, lack of understanding, and inability to get things done and lack of experience. I also think the other big barrier is going to be resistance. It is going to be very important for people to organize and get involved and reach out to their legislators and make their voices heard. And so the last thing I'll end with is you really saw Trump backing off the extreme anti-abortion agenda by the end of his campaign because he sensed that Americans didn't actually support that. And he is not deeply, deeply invested, I think, in trying to shut down repro and LGBT rights. That's not what has driven him his whole life. And if he feels like that's going to be unpopular and hurt his administration, that, by the end of the campaign, he was calling himself the father of IVF. That is a hopeful sign for the effect that resistance and speaking out and people making their views clear can have. So we shall see. These are things to look at. These are not necessarily things he will be able to achieve.
Thank you so much. Now, I want to give everybody a couple seconds just to say one ray of light or one short thing that you want people to take away from the conversation. And I'll start with Representative Turner.
Thank you. Lots of praise and light. I think for me, I guess like the overarching thing is that, like I mentioned before, is that like hope is an action, right? It's an action that you have to engage in every day, right? If we believe that we have the power to change, then we have to be engaged. Rest is important, and we are also at a very, very serious time. And so while rest is important, remember to dig in and really dig in when and where you can. It has been nice being outside of the legislature. It's given me a little bit of time and a little bit of breath to also be able to plug back into community resources that I hadn't been able to in such a way in a very long time. And I think like that's the thing too, right? That also really motivates me. It's like politically the world is on fire and communities get to thrive in that area. I am an Okie through and through, ag land grant institution. And so what it feels like to me in this moment is that the nation is full of farmers and we are having to do a controlled burn to be able to make sure that we have crops for the future, right? That we have good soil to grow good crops to take care of our people. And so some of you may understand that and some of you may not, but it feels like the government is on fire, and it also feels like a time where I am ready to plug in and engage in a way that makes sure our communities are taken care of on a local level too. And I really, really hope that you all are plugging into those things, whether it's a community garden or you get to volunteer at the local elementary school or community center, right? Or you get to start a program, right? Women, infants, and children that the nation does, like that started from communities. Most of these public programs that help our communities started in community, and the government got a hold of it, and like we get to engage in that work again, and we should always be engaging in that work. And so my ray of light as a Capricorn is probably more work, but also I can't stress enough that I would not be able to engage and be and feel like this in this moment if I didn't rest. So rest is very important too. Yeah.
Thank you so very much. I will turn it to Andrew. A quick ray of light.
Yeah. I guess when I think about these moments, I think about kind of how different and diverse LGBTQ people are, and how it's quite possible that there could be many lines that kind of could potentially divide or kind of separate us. And I think back to the 70s when Anita Bryant had her campaigns in Florida, and there was a song and slogan that came out afterward, "Thank you, Anita Bryant," because her attacks on the community kind of brought us all together in a way that hadn't been as unified in the past. And so my silver lining is kind of, as younger generations are more LGBTQ, it could be possible that some might not necessarily see it as a relevant like factor in kind of their life outcomes. And what this administration, this next administration and the campaign that has been run kind of tells us is that you are kind of being targeted, and you are going to be affected by these policies. So I think my silver lining is that it will kind of, I would expect, hopefully, kind of keep the group strongly together, and kind of help us kind of mobilize as a community, in a way that I think is important.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Andi.
Ray of light. So I think what I keep coming back to is my struggle with the overwhelming problem of trying to fight the disinformation campaign, and knowing that, TikTok had so many creative people on it that were sharing. But also, like, my ray of light is that these people really being targeted with these attacks are probably the most creative community that exists right now. And so, if we all do things like this and become aware of the true basis of the problem, I think that there's nobody better equipped to combat the misinformation and disinformation in a creative way that can ultimately break through and find its message to the bigger population than the people being disenfranchised by these terrible policies. And what better way to motivate them than this insane attack on people's identity and who we are? And so I hope that we will take away from that the creativity needed and the idea that, we can and will persevere and figure out how to better these folks. Because, like I started in my last statement, right? Like, this isn't happening because of us. This narrative that, that these, bathroom identity, gender situations, right after the election, they came out and they criticized Kamala for focusing on that. But if you go back through all of her speeches, she didn't even talk about it, right? So this is their push onto the people of what they're afraid of and pushing that on. And I just know that, LGBTQ, I mean, all of the stereotypes that we love the most are the reasons that we're going to thrive and succeed and push sanity on the rest of the world through creative ways that are actually going to reach them, because the straight, uninspired community can only do so much. So
thank you so much. And I'll give the final closing words to Representative Mauree from New Hampshire.
Thank you. I definitely related to what Rep. Turner was talking about with community, and how much community is the thing that's motivating me and giving me hope right now. I was really afraid of the fear and outcomes of this election turning people towards apathy and despair. And I've actually seen a lot of energy in my community to engage even harder and to push back on the narratives and what's been happening, and really dig into taking care of ourselves, and also reaching out to our neighbors and trying to change beliefs on a person-to-person level, which I think is really crucial for the next few years. I always say, like, it shouldn't be on us to like have to do this, but so many people haven't even met a trans person, and like being able to like be that person that's like, hi, I'm not like what you've heard on the media, and we can have a relationship, and you can ask me questions, and etc. Like being able to like understand our communities for what they are and meet them where they're at, and engage on a person-to-person level is what's giving me hope, and what I think is necessary for making a better future.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to our panelists. I know each of you has so much more to share, so I hope we have more chances to talk. But in the meantime, I want to just thank you again for your time today. Thank you to our audience and your amazing questions. And we hope to create more opportunities to learn, discuss, and share ideas. So thank you from the Williams Institute, and take care.